Shakuyas, what Ottomans did to Christian nuns was worse than death. There are fates worse than death. History knows this, but few stories prove it as horrifically as what happened to 22 Christian nuns in the 15th century. What the Ottoman Empire did to these women wasn't just cruel. It was calculated, methodical, designed to break not just their bodies, but their very souls. And the worst part, they wanted them alive for it. This is the story of the Silent Sisters, women erased from history, women whose suffering was so unbearable that the empire itself tried to hide what they'd done. But the truth has a way of surviving, even in darkness, even centuries later. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about human endurance, about faith, about what it means to resist when resistance seems impossible. Phaetas, the end of everything. Picture a small convent nestled in the hills of Thessaly, stone walls thick enough to keep out winter winds, gardens where herbs grow for medicine and prayer, a small library filled with handwritten manuscripts, icons painted by generations of devoted hands. Inside, nuns live quiet lives of devotion, their days measured in hymns and scripture, their nights in silent contemplation. These women chose poverty, chastity, obedience. They chose God. They chose peace. They chose a life removed from the chaos of the world. For decades, this convent stood as a beacon of learning and faith. Women from across the region came here to escape forced marriages, to find education, to dedicate themselves to something higher. The walls protected them. The mountains hid them. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. Then the Ottomans came. Sister Eleni of Lissa heard them first, the thunder of hooves echoing through the valley, the clash of steel against steel, the screams that cut through the morning prayer. She gathered her sisters in the chapel, their voices rising in desperate prayer as the wooden doors began to splinter under the weight of axes and battering rams. These weren't soldiers looking for gold or land. They were there to conquer souls, to erase Christianity from the map, one monastery at a time, to send a message that nowhere was safe, that no one would be spared. The invasion was savage, systematic, merciless. Nuns were dragged from the altar by their hair, their habits torn from their bodies, their sacred spaces violated in ways that history struggles to record. Some died quickly, cut down as they knelt in prayer. The lucky ones. Others were captured, their hands bound with rope that cut into flesh, thrown into the courtyard, like animals awaiting slaughter. The convent that had stood for generations burned, its library consumed by flames, its icons smashed, its centuries of devotion reduced to ash and rubble and smoke that rose like a funeral pyre into the Greek sky. The youngest nun was barely 16, the oldest 73. None of that mattered to the invaders. The offer that was a trap. In the smoldering ruins, the survivors were forced to their knees, 22 women, bruised, bleeding, terrified, some with broken bones, others with wounds that would never heal. The Ottoman captain stood before them, his armor gleaming in the firelight, his voice almost gentle, almost merciful, almost kind. He offered Sister Eleni a choice, a simple choice. Renounce your faith, convert to Islam, speak the Shahada, just words, just sounds your mouth can make. Live, continue breathing, see another sunrise, feel rain on your face again. It's so simple, so easy, just say the words. She looked him in the eye, this woman who'd spent 4 decades in prayer, who'd never raised her voice in anger, who'd chosen humility above all else, who'd washed the feet of beggars and tended the sick. And she said something that would echo through history, that would be written in letters and chronicles and whispered in monasteries for centuries. I have already given my life to Christ. What else can you take from me? The captain's face darkened. He'd expected begging, tears, submission, bargaining. He'd seen it 1,000 times before. Men and women who'd talk tough until the blade came close, until the fire got hot, until death became real instead of abstract. But instead he got defiance wrapped in serenity. It enraged him. Because Eleni understood something he didn't. Something that would become the key to this entire story. Death wasn't the punishment. Death was mercy. What came next was the real torture. The captain made her a martyr. Quick, public, a sword through the heart, a symbol of resistance. Her body left in the ruins as a warning. But for the others, the 22 who remained, the ones who watched their leader die, he had something infinitely worse planned, something that would make them beg for the mercy Eleni received. The March of Horrors. They were chained together like slaves, heavy iron shackles around their ankles, forced to march toward the coast through territory that had once been their homeland, but now felt like enemy land, miles and miles and miles, through villages that had been razed, past bodies left rotting in fields, over mountains where the thin air made every step agony, their feet bleeding through their worn sandals, their bodies breaking under the weight of chains and exhaustion and despair. No food except moldy bread thrown at them like dogs, little water except what they could cup from streams when allowed. The sun beat down mercilessly by day, baking them in their dark habits. At night, the cold cut through their torn clothing like knives. They slept on bare ground, sometimes not at all. Guards kicked them awake before dawn, forced them to march until they collapsed, then beat them until they rose. This wasn't just transportation, it was torture, a public spectacle designed to humiliate. Villages lined up to watch as these holy women stumbled past, their dignity stripped away, their sacred vows made mockery. Children threw stones, men spat, women turned away. Some of the nuns collapsed from exhaustion. They were beaten with wooden rods until they stood. Some begged for death. They were denied. Death would come later, after they'd suffered enough, after they'd been broken completely. When they reached the coast, the sight of the sea should have been beautiful. Instead, it meant something worse was coming. They were loaded onto ships, packed into dark holds where the air was thick with disease and despair and human waste. The voyage to Constantinople took weeks, weeks in darkness, weeks breathing air that barely qualified as breathable. Women died in that darkness, fever, infection, broken hearts, their bodies thrown overboard like garbage. No prayers, no burial, no recognition that they'd ever been human. Nothing. Centuries later, historians would discover an Ottoman ledger, a bureaucratic record documenting the transport of religious captives from Thessaly to Constantinople. 22 names reduced to a line item: cargo, property, things to be moved from one place to another. But that ledger also contained something else, something the bureaucrats didn't intend. It contained proof, evidence that this happened, that these women existed, that their suffering was real. The illusion of mercy, Constantinople, the jewel of the Ottoman Empire, the city of cities. The Topkapi Palace rose above the Bosphorus like a monument to power and wealth and conquest. Inside its walls, gardens bloomed, fountains splashed, music played. The Grand Vizier waited in a room decorated with gold and silk and treasures looted from 100 conquered lands. The surviving nuns were brought before him. How many had died on the march? On the ships? We don't know exactly, but fewer than 22 women stood in that ornate chamber, starving, filthy, barely alive, their eyes hollow, their bodies wasted, barely recognizable as human. He looked at them with something almost like pity, almost like compassion, and he made his offer. His voice was calm, reasonable, almost fatherly. Convert, accept Islam, submit to the will of Allah. You'll be given food, real food, clothing that's clean and whole, respect, honor. You'll live in comfort. You can even continue to pray in your own way privately. Just accept the Shahada publicly. Just say the words. All you have to do is renounce the lie of Christ. Admit that your God abandoned you, that he let your convent burn, that he watched your sisters die. Where was he then? Where is he now? Every single one refused. Silence, complete silence. They didn't even dignify the offer with words. They just stood there, starving, dying, and yet unbroken in the one way that mattered. The vizier's patience evaporated like morning dew. His face hardened. These weren't martyrs dying heroically for their faith. That would make them saints. That would make them dangerous. No. He wanted something more insidious, something more complete. He wanted them to suffer so totally, so absolutely, that death would seem like paradise in comparison. He wanted to prove that their God had abandoned them, that faith was meaningless, that resistance was futile. He wanted to break them so thoroughly that when they finally converted, it would prove the superiority of Islam. It would prove that Christianity was weak, false, powerless. They were taken to the underground chambers beneath the palace, dungeons that most people didn't know existed, prisons disguised as mercy, places where people went in but never came out, at least not as the same people, captivity that devoured souls. Imagine spending years in absolute darkness, not dim light, not shadows, absolute, complete, total darkness. No windows, no candles, no sunlight, no moon, no stars, no sense of time, no way to know if it's day or night, if it's winter or summer, if weeks have passed or months or years. The only sounds are distant footsteps echoing through stone corridors, the drip of water somewhere in the blackness, the echoes of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, your own thoughts slowly eating themselves. The nuns were stripped of their religious habits, those sacred garments they'd worn for years, decades, the physical symbols of their devotion, forced into rags that barely covered them, made to serve Ottoman officials like slaves, cleaning floors on hands and knees, cooking food they'd never taste, carrying water, emptying chamber pots, labor that ground them down day after day after day, humiliation that never ended. But that was just the surface, the visible torture. The real torture was psychological, mental, spiritual. They were isolated, deliberately separated from each other so they couldn't pray together, couldn't support each other, couldn't share their faith, kept in cells so small they could barely stand, could barely turn around, forced to sleep on stone, fed just enough to survive, never enough to live, never enough to have energy, never enough to think clearly, just enough to keep breathing, to keep suffering. And the darkness did something to them. Human beings aren't meant to live in complete darkness. Our brains need light, need visual stimulation. Without it, we start to hallucinate, to lose sense of reality, to forget who we are. Some of the nuns began to lose their minds, talking to people who weren't there, seeing things that didn't exist. The darkness became a living thing, a presence, an entity that pressed down on them like weight. When kindness and persuasion failed, the empire tried different tactics. Scholars came to debate theology, learned men with arguments polished over decades. Imams promised salvation, paradise, eternal joy. They offered education, access to the greatest library in the world, luxury beyond imagination, safety, security, protection, all for one word. Just say you accept Islam. Just speak the words. Your heart doesn't have to believe. God knows what's in your heart. Just say the words publicly and privately. You can believe whatever you want. The sisters stayed silent. That's when the rumors began. Palace servants started whispering. Guards started talking. Stories spread through Constantinople like fire. The silent sisters, women who never spoke, never begged, never screamed, never broke, even under torture, even starving. Even in darkness so complete it drove others mad, their silence became legendary, became terrifying, because even in chains, even forgotten in dungeons beneath the palace, they radiated something the empire couldn't destroy, something that made hardened soldiers uncomfortable, something that made jailers avoid looking at them. Faith, not the weak faith of Sunday prayers and comfortable worship, but faith forged in fire, tempered in suffering, unbreakable. Years passed, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Time became meaningless in the darkness. The empire escalated their methods. Starvation became routine, not occasional. Daily. Meals reduced to scraps, then to nothing for days at a time. Water rationed, bodies wasting away, skin hanging on bones, teeth falling out from malnutrition, hair turning white from stress and suffering. Some nuns, worn down beyond human endurance, finally surrendered. You cannot judge them. No one can. They'd endured more than any person should, more than most could survive. They converted. They spoke the Shahada. They were released from the darkness, given food, given light, given freedom. They vanished into history, into the populations of Constantinople, their names lost, their stories untold. But most did not surrender. Sister Magdalena emerged as their quiet leader. She'd been young when captured, 23, bright-eyed, full of hope. Now she was gaunt, her hair white, her body broken by years of abuse and starvation and darkness. But her spirit blazed brighter than ever. She helped the others survive through prayer, through shared memories of the convent, through reciting scripture from memory in the darkness, through sheer force of will. And they did something extraordinary, something that proves the human spirit can never truly be conquered, something that would be discovered centuries later and make archaeologists weep. They carved crosses into the stone walls in total darkness, using fragments of metal they found, shards of broken pottery, pieces of bone, their own fingernails worn down to bleeding. They etched Latin verses, psalms they'd memorized, names of sisters who'd died, acts of defiance that no one would see for centuries, that might never be seen. But it didn't matter. It wasn't for the empire. It wasn't for history. It was for God. It was for themselves. It was proof that they still existed, that they were still human, that they still believed. In one cell, archaeologists would later find the entire 23rd Psalm carved into stone. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Carved by a woman who hadn't seen green in years, who would never see it again, who carved it anyway. In a corner of their shared prison, accessible only through crawling through a narrow gap in the stonework, the sisters created something impossible, something that defied every attempt to crush them. A secret chapel. They saved drops of oil from lamps, hoarded them like treasure, used them to make improvised candles that burned for mere minutes, found a piece of metal shaped vaguely like a cross, arranged stones into an altar, swept the floor clean with their hands. In absolute darkness, in a place designed to destroy faith, they built a sanctuary. This wasn't rebellion. This was transcendence. This was victory of a kind the empire couldn't comprehend. Women who'd lost everything, every comfort, every dignity, every visible sign of God's presence, still found a way to worship, to pray, to believe that their suffering meant something, that God hadn't abandoned them even when the world had, even when it seemed like the darkness would swallow everything. They would crawl to this chapel one by one, light their precious candle, pray for minutes in the flickering light, then extinguish it to save oil, return to darkness. But those minutes sustained them, gave them hope, gave them purpose, made the suffering bearable because it was offered up as prayer, as sacrifice, as communion with something greater than the empire that imprisoned them. And then the most remarkable discovery. In 1928, archaeologists excavating beneath the Topkapi ruins found it, a small chamber, hidden, forgotten, sealed by centuries of renovation and reconstruction. When they broke through the wall, they found walls covered in Latin inscriptions, crosses carved everywhere, hundreds of them, some tiny, some as large as a hand, a stone altar, and one phrase, still visible after 5 centuries, carved deeper than all the others, that made hardened historians weep. Lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebrae eam non comprehenderunt. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. These women had been erased, forgotten, buried beneath centuries of history and empire and progress, but their chapel survived, their prayers survived, their faith survived. The empire that imprisoned them fell. The sultan who ordered their capture died. The palace crumbled, but the words they carved in darkness remained, waiting, testifying, refusing to be silenced. Ottoman archives are meticulous, almost obsessive. They recorded everything, every tax collected, every trade agreement, every military campaign, every prisoner taken, every conversion, every death. The bureaucracy of empire documented in infinite detail. But there's one page that's blank, one record that's incomplete, 21 names that should have been there. An intentional erasure. Someone in the imperial bureaucracy decided these women should be forgotten, that their story should die with them, that no one should know what happened in the darkness beneath the palace. But erasure is never complete. Decades later, letters surfaced, found in monastery archives across Greece, spy reports sent by Venetian agents in Constantinople, memoirs from palace servants written years after the fact. They all mention the same thing: Christian women who sang themselves into heaven, women who died in the darkness but refused to die defeated, women whose faith echoed through the palace like accusation. One letter written by a palace guard to his brother describes hearing singing from the underground chambers, hymns in Latin, voices weak from starvation but harmonizing perfectly. He wrote that it haunted him, that he heard it in his dreams, that he couldn't reconcile the beauty of the sound with the horror of what was being done to them. Their story became legend, whispered in monasteries from Mount Athos to Rome, passed down through generations. The Silent Sisters, women whose names were stolen but whose courage could never be erased, who proved that the empire could take everything except what mattered most. This isn't ancient history. This isn't a fairy tale or myth or legend embellished beyond recognition. This is documented fact, archaeological evidence, historical records, testimony that survived against all odds. This is a testament to what human beings can endure, what faith can survive, what the human spirit refuses to surrender even when everything else is taken. The Silent Sisters face something worse than death. They face the slow, methodical destruction of everything they were, the erosion of identity, dignity, hope. The Ottoman Empire had perfected the art of breaking people without killing them, of making survival itself a punishment, of turning existence into suffering so complete that death became desirable. They understood that martyrdom creates heroes, so they denied martyrdom. They created conditions where living required more courage than dying, but they didn't break. 22 women, most we'll never know by name. Most died in darkness without ever seeing sky again, without ever feeling wind, without ever tasting freedom. But they died undefeated. Their silence became a weapon more powerful than any sword. Their suffering became testimony that no empire could suppress. Their faith became eternal because it transcended the physical world that tried to crush it. We remember them now, not as victims, as warriors, as proof that some lights can't be extinguished, some prayers can't be silenced, some souls can't be conquered no matter how much power you bring to bear against them. They lost everything except the one thing that mattered, and in losing everything else they proved that the one thing was enough. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has never overcome it, not in the 15th century, not ever.